All right, we're going to start with Chapter 6, Ethics, Economics, and Sustainable Development. So the first thing is this case study, and the case study is actually going through Costa Rica, and it was found that its forests were actually being cut down and decimated, so it created a policy that paid private landowners to conserve forests. Paid for the program through special taxes through fossil fuels. It also helped to spur the ecotourism industry as well, which helped its economy quite a bit in Costa Rica. And essentially, some of the big things that we should know is the ecosystem services that forests provide. You can see those actually right in here. You should probably have these 4 things memorized. Watershed protection, so filtering the pollutants and reducing erosion by slowing runoff. It keeps biodiversity in check. Scenic beauty for recreation and ecotourism, as well as the absorption and storage of carbon by pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, which is going to slow the processes of global warming. So we're going to move a few more places on to John Muir. And John Muir is actually a preservationist. We talked about him in the last unit. He's someone who wants to preserve and not touch nature. He was the founder of the Sierra Club, and there was actually a famous meeting that went back to him and Teddy Roosevelt in Yosemite in 1903. Roosevelt was so moved by this meeting that he actually ended up heading back to Congress, and Congress made 5 new additional national parks. You need to know Emerson, Whitman, and Thoreau, and these guys are transcendentalist authors. They wrote about nature. Then we have Gifford Pinchot, which is right on here. Again, we talked about him in the last unit. He's a conservationist, and he's a proponent of using resources but not depleting them. So he founded the U.S. National Forest Service. In national forests, not national parks, trees can actually be cut down and then replanted for a chance to have them grow and be cut down again later on. So forests don't disappear, but they're actually being conserved. So Pinchot and Muir did not actually like each other. They don't have the same philosophies. They didn't really get along. Another individual in this section is Aldo Leopold. There's actually a lot of places around here that have been named after him. He's an author. He wrote a book called The Sand County Almanac, and he had an essay that was pretty famous called The Land Ethic. He was an environmental ethicist, so he believed that nature and humans are actually interconnected. They rely on each other in order to survive. He looks a lot at ecosystem services and nature really providing us with what we need to survive. So how does that balance kind of reciprocate? Environmental justice is a pretty big idea. It's one that's been around for quite some time, but if you think about environmental justice, it's the fair treatment of all people with environmental laws and policies. Unfortunately, we don't always see this being done in an ethical manner. Typically, the poor and minority populations are exposed to the greatest share of pollutants and hazards and poisonings. This happens everywhere. It's not just in the United States, but it's the poor parts of town that usually have the older houses with asbestos and lead pipes and lead paint. It's usually the older parts of town that are getting exposed to more of the pollutants. California, people that live near the docks actually have more exposure to lead. Examples from the book highlight the Navajo Indians and actually the uranium mines that are within the properties. And but again, there's examples not only from the United States but across the world. We're going to move into types of economies. So the big thing with the types of economies, it's classical and it's neoclassical, and really they both kind of mean the same thing. They're more of this capitalist view. But classical economics is the invisible hand, the market, and no government kind of involved in here. It's a self-interest economy. Pluses to this are that usually the richer industries and nations are going to gain a lot more money. Some negatives to this is because of the free market policy, we're going to see more environmental degradation and inequalities between like richer individuals and poor. You're going to see a bigger deficit within that. So the neoclassical economics, again, kind of along the same pathway, just a different time frame. this is more of a supply and demand with the market. So this determines the goods outputs and income in a market based on supply and demand. So this is your free trade. There are some good and bad along with this as well. Some of those things we don't think about is the fact that our resources are not infinite. So just because we have a demand doesn't mean that we always necessarily have to find a supply. Sometimes we try to decimate our supply. Sometimes we try to replace one characteristic material with another one, and that can actually get us into a rut. Another big thing is the external costs that we don't think about. So knowing the definition of external costs is important. These are costs of things above and beyond, like health problems that are associated with the mining company, stress or other things that may come from pollution sources. The fact that your property decreases in certain values if you put up, let's say, wind turbines. Aesthetic damage from stuff like mining or clear cutting, declines in property, so property damage in general, loss of tourism or revenue if you're starting to cut down all of your trees. So there is going to start to be these external costs to, supply and demand. We're going to skip ahead a couple more pages. So these are figures and captions that go along with non-market values of things. So these things aren't worth money, but if lost, could be a huge loss to us in general. So know some of these examples. We have species existence, we have cultural, scientific, and educational values. These are actually the goals that College Board put out for this year. So understand ecosystem services come in 4 categories. There's provisioning, regulating, cultural, and supporting. Humans can actually disrupt ecosystem services, resulting in economic and or ecological consequences. If we don't have the ability to study some of these things, maybe we're going to miss out on future cure for, cancer or some other disease. Okay, this is a caption that goes into the differences between gross domestic product and GPI, which is the Genuine Progress Indicator. GPI, this one right here, is something that social scientists, researchers, and environmental scientists use because it's a more accurate view of what our economy actually looks like. GDP is something that is mostly reported but is inaccurate because it makes us look more economically strong. But in fact, we have to pay for stuff like environmental costs, social costs, and economic costs, which actually work against our gross product. So GPI is a more accurate picture of our economy, but governments don't like to use it because GDP actually looks better. It looks like we're making a whole lot more. So make sure you know the differences between these two and why we feel in an environmental science class that GPI is actually better representation of our economy.